I hadn't planned to cry at the baby shower. I'd woken up that morning with a flutter in my chest, the kind of excited tightness I hadn't felt since my son David was born. I'd steamed my beige cardigan, pressed a blouse I hadn't worn since his wedding, and wrapped the booties I knit in paper dotted with tiny yellow ducks. They were simple, wool, soft, and a little lopsided. But I'd stitched them during the quiet hours, watching old reruns while the tea kettle hissed behind me. Every loop was a whisper of love. Megan had chosen a theme: pale green balloons, faux eucalyptus garlands, and a massive Hello Little One sign, cut from gold foil letters that shimmered under the skylight. There were no games, just mingling. Everything was curated to match the Pinterest board she'd emailed me weeks ago with the subject line, "For reference only." Finally, she stopped near the gift table. I stepped forward, smiling, heart thudding. "Oh, Megan," I said, extending the gift. "I knit these for him. I hope." I stood by the cake table, holding the booties, waiting for the right moment. Megan was glowing, hair flat-ironed into a perfect sheet, her bump dressed in a silky white wrap dress. She drifted from circle to circle like a host at a gallery opening, not once making eye contact with me. She took the box without looking. "Thanks," she said, half distracted. "Set it down over there?" I did, still smiling, still hopeful. Then she turned to someone beside her and said it loud enough to hush the table. "Don't touch the baby, okay? You're too fragile." She didn't look at me when she said it, but the words hit like a thrown glass. Everyone around us froze. A woman holding a deviled egg looked away. Someone coughed. David, standing near the punch bowl, kept stirring like he hadn't heard anything at all. I didn't speak. My arms were still half extended from where I'd handed her the gift. I let them fall slowly to my sides, and smiled that tight, too wide smile old women wear when something inside them breaks but they refuse to let it leak. I stayed another 40 minutes. I made small talk with Megan's cousin, who talked about organic formula as if it were wartime strategy. I complimented the centerpieces. I took one picture with Megan and David where I didn't blink fast enough to hide the hurt, and then I left. By the time I got home, I was shaking. I didn't turn on the lights, just walked to the kitchen, set down my purse, and sat at the table. The house was silent, except for the soft ticking of the clock above the stove and the hum of the old fridge. My fingers still smelled like buttercream frosting. Too fragile. She had said it, like I was a vase, a glass ornament, to be set aside. Not a woman who had raised her only son alone after his father walked out when David was 5. Not a woman who had saved her lunch money to buy David his first set of paint markers when he said he wanted to be an architect. Not a woman who had paid for half of that nursery in her tiny house without hesitation. I leaned forward and rested my head in my hands. The knit booties had taken me 3 weeks. I imagined them discarded in a pile of wrapping paper or maybe stuffed into a drawer and forgotten. There was no place for women like me anymore. Not in baby photos, not in birth plans, and certainly not in homes with pastel-themed showers and curated social feeds. It had been sent in a text from David weeks ago. "Only if you want to," he'd said. I'd clicked it, selected the nursery fund link, and donated $6,000. Enough for the crib, changing table, blackout curtains, and an expensive glider. Megan had circled on a page she'd left on my coffee table. That night, I logged into the baby registry website. I hadn't left a comment. I didn't need a badge or a digital thank you. But tonight, I checked the donor page out of morbid curiosity. "Special thanks to Grandma Marla for the biggest contribution." There it was. Below it, a comment Megan had added, "We're so lucky to have such generous family. Baby boy is already so loved. Loved, but not allowed to touch. Loved, but apparently too breakable to hold." The next day, I called David. He picked up on the second ring. "Hey Mom, everything okay?" "I wanted to talk about yesterday," I said. A long pause. "Look, Megan didn't mean it like that. She's just careful. You know, pregnancy brain. Hormones. She gets overwhelmed." Another pause. "She called me fragile." "It's not personal," he said finally. "She's just being protective. I held you the day you were born," I said. "Your head fit in my palm. I didn't drop you then." He didn't reply. "I knit booties for a baby I might never hold," I added, quieter now. "Mom, come on. You're overthinking this. I almost said am I, but instead I just said goodbye. I reached for the red folder tucked beneath my recipe books. It held the documentation from the nursery fund transfer. David had signed it. Not a gift. A conditional contribution, a clause added by my late husband's lawyer before he passed, insisting family funds be used in service of family trust. If that trust was broken, later that night, I took down the framed ultrasound they'd mailed me and put it in the drawer beside the sewing kit. I sat in my rocker and turned the lamp low. In the quiet, I could hear the house creak softly under its own weight. I ran my fingers along the edge of the paper. Too fragile, she said. Let's see if their nursery plans were built that way too. I didn't make a grand gesture. No storming into their house, no lectures or guilt-ridden letters. That's never been my way. I've always believed in quiet strength, the kind you don't need to shout about for it to hold weight. So I called my late husband's financial advisor, Martin Graves, a calm-voiced man with neat handwriting and a habit of sipping from chipped mugs even during Zoom calls. You're within your rights to revoke the remaining disbursement, he said gently. Do you want to leave a reason on file? He remembered the fund agreement right away. I thought about that for a moment. No. Let the silence speak. Martin paused. You understand this might complicate things between you and your son? There it was, the question hidden inside every action I'd ever taken as a mother. Are you willing to hurt your son to stand up for yourself? I stared out my window, where the maple tree had just begun to turn orange at the tips. Yes, I said. I think I finally am. By Thursday, the funds were frozen. I didn't tell anyone. Megan would find out when the contractor emailed her about the final invoice for the nursery build-out. The custom paint job, the built-in shelving, all of it hung on that second installment. I went about my day, grocery shopping, picking up more yarn, sitting on the bench at the park where David used to chase squirrels with a stick in each hand like some kind of forest knight. Life doesn't announce when you've crossed a line. It just feels different in your bones. Saturday morning, the knock came earlier than I expected. I had just set a tray of banana muffins on the counter to cool when I heard the sharp, impatient rap of knuckles. Not the soft hesitation of a neighbor or delivery guy. No, this was someone with a point to make. I opened the door and found David on my porch. His jaw was tight, his coat half-zipped. Behind him, the wind stirred leaves into the corner of the steps. Can we talk? He asked. He didn't sit, just stood there, near the hallway like he didn't want to get too comfortable. I stepped aside. I'm guessing you canceled the nursery disbursement, he said. Why? I wiped my hands on a towel and met his gaze. Yes. You already know why. I leaned against the counter. David, if she'd called me old or slow, I might have brushed it off. But fragile, that wasn't about my bones. That was about control. He let out a short breath, something between a sigh and a laugh. Mom, this is petty. Megan, she didn't mean it like that. She's pregnant, emotional, overwhelmed. He looked away. And I didn't pull the money out of revenge. I did it because I will not fund a nursery in a house where I am not welcome. That landed. He didn't speak for a long time. Do you think this helps the situation? He finally asked. After he left, I sat down in the living room. The ache in my knees reminded me I hadn't eaten breakfast, but I didn't move. I just sat with it all. I think it shows I'm not invisible. I didn't cry, not because it didn't hurt, but because something deeper had settled in me. A stillness. Like I'd finally stepped out of a costume I'd been wearing for years. The agreeable mother. The silent helper. The one who stays in her lane, no matter how narrow it gets. Sunday came and went without a word. Monday too. On Tuesday, I went to the library to return a book and found Megan sitting in the front seat of her car outside. She rolled down the window before I could pass. Hi, she said, voice low. She gestured to the passenger seat. Can you sit for a second? Hi. I nodded. I hesitated, then opened the door and lowered myself in. I heard what happened, she said. The funding. She looked down at her hands. Her nails were perfectly shaped. Her thumb rubbed her ring like it was a worry stone. I just wanted things to be clean, she said quietly. Perfect. The shower, the nursery, the arrival. No mess, no unpredictability. I watched her carefully. When I said what I said, her voice broke a little. I was thinking about the NICU. My sister was born premature. My mom was constantly sick. Hospitals were my childhood. So you're scared? I said. Yes. And when you reached out, when you offered help, it felt like pressure instead of comfort. And that's not fair. I see that now. I waited. I don't know how to fix it, she said. I don't need you to fix it, I replied. I need you to see me. Not as fragile, not as a burden, but as part of this family. Her eyes filled with tears. You are. I just didn't know how to share control without feeling like I'd lose it all. We all carry our own ghosts, I said, surprising even myself. She nodded. Can I show you the nursery? I exhaled. A long one. Yes, I'd like that. That afternoon, I walked through the house I once helped finance, past the front room where David had once sprawled on the carpet with Legos, into the space that would welcome a new life. The walls were soft sage. The crib sat under a mobile of painted wooden animals. The changing table was unfinished. Contractor paused mid-project. Megan stood beside me, arms folded under her belly. I don't know if you want to help again, she said, but this time, only if you want to. I reached into my purse and handed her a small wrapped box. Inside was a fresh pair of booties, this time in soft sage yarn to match the room. I already did. The baby arrived on a Tuesday. David's voice on the phone was different. This time, hushed, careful, like someone stepping into a cathedral. He didn't say much, just that Megan and the baby were safe. That it had been long and exhausting, but everyone was okay. Is he beautiful? I asked. David laughed softly. The way people do when their entire world is tilted and new. Yeah, Mom, he is. I sat on the edge of my bed with the phone pressed to my cheek, long after the call ended. The house felt smaller now, as if the silence had leaned in close to listen too. For a moment I let myself imagine it, his tiny feet, his curled fists, the softness of his breath on someone's chest. Then I remembered I hadn't been invited to the hospital. 3 days passed before I heard from them again. I busied myself with houseplants, overwatering some and forgetting others. I took walks just to see mailboxes, to remind myself that other people were still receiving news. At the grocery store, I lingered near the baby aisle, pretending I was looking for something. On Friday morning, a single photo arrived on my phone. It's a strange thing, becoming a grandmother while staying a stranger. A baby, swaddled in a cream blanket, sleeping in soft light. His cheeks were round and red, his mouth slightly open, a shock of dark hair peeking out from under a beanie. Underneath was a caption, Meet Elliot, David, 7 pounds, 2 ounces, home and healthy. No invite to visit. No can you come by. Just a picture. I stared at it until my phone locked itself from inactivity. I didn't respond immediately. Not out of pride, but because I didn't know what to say. I wanted to write, he's perfect, or congratulations, but everything felt flat. Instead, I went to the hall closet and reached for the box I'd hidden behind the extra quilts. Inside were things I hadn't wrapped yet. 2 more pairs of booties, this time sized up for winter. A picture book about a grandmother bear and her curious cub, and a blanket crocheted slowly over 2 months in between herbal tea and the evening news. I ran my fingers along the yarn and felt something pull tight inside my chest. I packed it all into a paper bag and drove it over. I didn't knock. I just left the bag on their porch and rang the doorbell. Then I turned and walked back to the car, not looking over my shoulder. The air was crisp and carried that late autumn scent of leaves and change. I kept my hands tucked deep in my coat pockets, resisting the urge to brace myself like I always had with expectation. Halfway down the block, I heard the door open behind me. I didn't stop walking. Later that night, David texted. We got your gifts. Thank you, Mom. The blanket is beautiful. So are the boots. I replied simply. You're welcome. Let me know if you ever need anything. The days blurred after that. I went about my routines with an odd sense of anticipation that refused to settle. I wasn't excluded anymore, but I wasn't quite included either. I was adjacent, like one of those satellites that circles the Earth but never lands. Then, 2 weeks later, Megan called. Her voice was shaky, tired in a way no amount of sleep could fix. I'm sorry to ask this, she began, but could you come by? Just for an hour or two? I said yes, before she could finish. When I arrived, the front door was already open. Inside, the house had the smell of milk and detergent, a sweetness that clung to the walls. Megan stood barefoot in the hallway, hair messy, hoodie stained with something she probably hadn't had time to wash out. Her eyes looked puffy, raw. I stepped closer, hesitant. "Where is he now?" "I haven't slept more than 40 minutes in a row," she said by way of greeting. "And he won't stop crying unless I hold him." "I'll take him," I said gently. Megan hesitated, then stepped back. She nodded toward the couch. A bassinet sat nearby. Elliot's face was red and scrunched, his fists flailed. I lifted him slowly, cradling him against my chest. He squirmed, wailed for a breath or two, then went still. I rocked him slightly, humming something tuneless from the back of my memory. Within minutes, his cries softened into hiccups, and then nothing at all. Megan stared. "I don't know how you did that," she whispered. "I just listened," I said. He needed a body that wasn't afraid. We sat together for the next hour without much speaking. She leaned against the wall, eyes fluttering shut and open again. I walked the room with Elliot in my arms, feeling the weight of him not as a burden but as a privilege. "I thought being a mother would come naturally," she said finally. "It doesn't," I replied. "It arrives slowly. One mistake, one diaper, one sleepless night at a time." She looked down. "I was afraid you'd say no. After everything. I would never turn away from my family," I said, "but I also won't pretend I'm not a part of it." She nodded, and I could see the pride cracking, the pieces of her beginning to fall into something softer, more human. As I stood by the window later, still holding Elliot, the late afternoon light spilled across the nursery wall. His eyes opened slightly, unfocused, but searching. I let him curl one of his tiny fingers around mine. He gripped. "You've got strong hands," I whispered. "Just like your daddy did." And for the first time since this all began, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still a place for me in this story, not as a relic or a cautionary tale, but as something real, something needed. A week later, Megan handed me a house key. It was early morning. I had just arrived to give her a few hours of sleep, while David returned to work. Elliot was napping on my chest in the glider, his breath soft and rhythmic, when she walked over holding the key between two fingers. No ceremony, no speech. "I figured it'd be easier this way," she said. "So, you don't have to knock. Your family." I looked up. Her voice was hoarse from sleep, her robe wrinkled, her hair in a quick bun. The dark circles under her eyes had softened since that first desperate call, but motherhood still clung to her like a second skin, exhausted, unfiltered, and real. "Thank you," I said simply, taking the key and sliding it onto my ring. That morning passed quietly. I fed Elliot a bottle while humming half-remembered lullabies, then changed him on the mat beside the crib. Megan rested upstairs, though I could hear her footsteps every so often, pacing, pausing, listening. There's something sacred about holding a baby when no one else is watching. No camera, no expectations, just the small weight of a life against your chest, trusting you completely. I didn't take it for granted. Not after everything. In the following days, I began showing up regularly. Not out of obligation, but because they kept asking. She told me about her mother, who died when she was 17, how she hated hospitals, but loved baking, how Megan still had one of her aprons folded in the back of a drawer and hadn't touched it in years. Sometimes it was to watch Elliot for an hour while Megan showered and folded laundry. Other times, it was to sit and keep her company during the long afternoons. When the silence in the house pressed down like fog, we spoke slowly, carefully, like two people learning how to speak the same language after years of misunderstanding. "I think I pushed you away because I didn't know how to let someone take that space," she said once, while peeling an orange at the counter. Like letting you in meant I had to forget her. "You don't have to make room by erasing someone," I told her. "Grief and love don't compete. They expect." She nodded, not crying, but close. David was slower to come around. He was polite, but distant. His warmth, cautious, like a boy caught between two loyalties. I could tell he carried guilt, though he never said so outright. Maybe he didn't have the words. Men often don't, but I saw it in the way he lingered after handing me the baby, or the way he set out 2 mugs of tea before I arrived, one already filled just the way I liked it. He was trying. And that was something. One Saturday afternoon, Megan asked if I wanted to help rearrange the nursery. Something about it feels off, she said. I think it's because I tried to make it look like the pictures instead of what we actually need. We spent the day shifting furniture, moving the crib away from the drafty window, and placing the rocking chair closer to the softest light. I folded the baby clothes while she sorted drawers. We made space for a small bookshelf and tucked my crocheted blanket into a woven basket at the foot of the glider. When we were done, she stood in the doorway and took a deep breath. "This feels more real," she said. "More ours." Later that evening, she asked if I wanted to hold Elliot while she took a walk around the block. I sat in the nursery, rocking gently, the baby wrapped snugly in my arms. And I knew I would do the same for Elliot. His tiny hands twitched in his sleep. I studied his face, how much of David I could see in his cheeks, in the way his brows furrowed slightly, even in rest. I whispered stories to him. He couldn't yet understand, stories of the first time I held his father, the time we built a birdhouse together, the way David once cried over a goldfish funeral, like it was a national tragedy. "I wasn't perfect," I murmured, "but I tried. Every day." When Megan returned, her eyes were clearer, her steps lighter. She lingered in the doorway, watching us. "You look like you've been doing this forever," she said softly. "I have," I replied with a smile. We shared a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, just full of all the things we didn't need to explain anymore. The next morning, a new photo appeared on Megan's social media. It was a candid shot of me in the nursery, Elliot in my arms, both of us bathed in soft window light. The caption read, "Meet Elliot's favorite person." I never imagined how much healing could happen when we stop trying to be perfect and start trying to be real. "Thank you, Marla, for showing me how." It was the first time she'd publicly acknowledged me since the pregnancy. The comments were full of hearts and well wishes, but I didn't care about that. What mattered was the quiet message underneath it all. "You belong here." I hadn't forced my way in. I hadn't demanded love or gratitude. I'd simply stood still until they saw I wasn't going anywhere. For the first time in a long while, I felt something settle in my chest, not resentment or grief or fear, just a kind of peace. Like I'd been waiting outside in the cold, and someone finally opened the door. I was not fragile. The rhythm of those early weeks formed its own quiet pattern. I'd come by twice a week, sometimes more, depending on how frazzled Megan sounded when she called. There were no more awkward silences or guarded apologies, only the soft shuffle of slippers on the floor, Elliot's cries echoing through the house, and the welcome sound of her voice asking, "Would you mind staying just a little longer?" I was foundational. I didn't mind. Not once. Some days Megan would nap while I watched over Elliot. Other days, she stayed beside me and shared small pieces of herself in the hush of the afternoon, stories about high school regrets, her fear of messing everything up, her mother's laughter, how she couldn't quite remember its tone anymore. I listened. I didn't offer fixes or philosophies, just presence. One morning, I arrived to find the dining table set with 2 cups of coffee and warm banana bread. "No baby duty yet," she said, smiling. "You've earned a break." We sat, sunlight falling across the table like spilled cream, and ate in silence at first. Then she asked something I hadn't expected. "Were you scared when you had David?" I took a sip of coffee, terrified and tired, but mostly aware that everything I did from that moment on would leave an echo. She looked at me closely, as though she were inspecting the echo I had left. Later that week, David called me himself. No prompting from Megan. "Thought maybe you could help with a surprise," he said. "We're planning something small for Megan's birthday. Just a few people, no fuss." "Of course," I said. "What do you need?" I was thinking maybe we could give her the nursery bookshelf she wanted, but personalized. Painted or something. We spent the next 2 afternoons working on it together in his garage. He brought the wood. I brought the paint. We chose soft green for the shelves and added stenciled vines and tiny animals on the sides. I painted a tiny fox sitting under a tree on the back panel, while David sanded the corners. At one point, he stopped and watched me work. "She loves you now. He said quietly. "Even if she doesn't always say it." "I don't need her to say it," I replied. "I just needed her to mean it." He nodded. "You were right. About the way things started. I let it happen." You were trying to keep peace, I said gently. But peace without truth is just silence. The day of Megan's birthday arrived like a shift in season, sudden and filled with a warmth we hadn't quite named yet. The house smelled like vanilla cupcakes and freshly brewed coffee. A few of her friends came by, bringing flowers and noisy laughter that startled Elliot more than once. I helped where I could, moving between the kitchen and the nursery. I didn't hover, I didn't hide, I simply belonged. When the time came to reveal the bookshelf, David carried it in with a sheepish grin, and Megan gasped, hands flying to her mouth. Oh, it's perfect. There's more, David said, nudging her closer. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a stack of books, some I'd saved from David's childhood, others I'd picked up over the years, waiting for the right hands. Megan turned to me, eyes glistening. You kept them all this time? I nodded. I just didn't know who I was saving them for. She hugged me then. Not a side hug, not a polite thank you squeeze, but a real one, tight and warm, with tears and gratitude all wrapped together. I held her like a daughter. That night, I stayed a little later than usual to help clean up. Megan carried Elliot upstairs, humming softly. David washed dishes at the sink. I was drying them when he said, "You've changed this house, Mom." I looked up. I didn't do it alone. It feels different now, lighter. No, he said, but you were the first to stand still. He handed me a plate. Our hands touched. A week later, something unexpected happened. I received a letter in the mail, handwritten, the envelope soft from being handled too many times. Inside was a note from Megan's aunt, someone I hadn't spoken to since the wedding. She wrote, "Dear Marla, Megan told me what happened. I wanted to say thank you. Not everyone would have stayed. Most people walk away when they're hurt, but you didn't. You showed up differently, and because of that, they changed too. My sister would have loved you. Warmly, Clarissa." I reread that letter 3 times, then placed it in the wooden box where I kept old cards and photographs. I sat in my rocker afterward, holding a cup of tea in one hand and the weight of years in the other. Not every story ends with dramatic reconciliations or public speeches. Some end in quiet revolutions, in a shelf repainted, a drawer restocked with memories, a hand reaching back after pushing you away. And some, like mine, don't really end at all. They just keep unfolding, one small act of grace at a time. Winter crept in slowly that year. The leaves clung longer to the branches, reluctant to fall, and the light began to shift earlier each evening, casting the streets in soft shadows by 4 o'clock. I had always liked this time of year, the smell of wood smoke, the crispness in the air that made each breath feel purposeful. Elliot was growing fast. The newborn squeaks had turned to gentle coos. His eyes followed movement now, and when I entered the room, he'd sometimes smile wide and gummy, the kind that made my knees go weak. Still, some days held a quiet tension. Fragile doesn't just vanish because someone stops saying it aloud. Megan had started calling me Grandma again. Not just in front of Elliot, but to other people. In the pediatrician's office, at the store. It slipped off her tongue with ease now, like the word had finally found its home. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry upstairs, I overheard Megan and David talking in hushed tones in the kitchen. "I know she helps," Megan said, "but sometimes I still feel like she's watching, judging." "I don't think she's judging, Meg. I think she's just present," David replied. There was a pause. Then the soft clink of a cup being set down. It's hard to be present when you feel like someone else already lived the version of motherhood you're trying to invent. Those words stuck with me for days. A few mornings later, Megan asked if I wanted to join her for a new mom and baby class she'd signed up for at the community center. "It's silly," she said quickly. "There's music and stretching and a bunch of lullabies, but they said you can bring a support person." I blinked. "You want me to come?" She nodded. "I'd like that." The class was cheerful chaos. Babies wriggled on colorful blankets while mothers, some in yoga pants, some in full makeup, sang songs and passed around stuffed animals shaped like vegetables. I sat beside Megan, feeling like an odd extra in a musical I hadn't auditioned for. But Megan smiled through the entire session. Her laughter was easy, unguarded. When Elliot giggled during a bouncing song, she beamed like the sun had risen just for her. Later, as we packed up, a woman with a tired ponytail and spit up on her shoulder glanced at me and said, "First time, Grandma?" Yes, I said, surprised by the lump that rose in my throat, and grateful for it. The next major shift came on a Sunday. It had snowed the night before, just a dusting, but enough to brighten the sidewalks and hush the neighborhood. David called in the morning, asking if I'd be willing to come by for lunch. "We'd like to talk to you about something," he said. That something turned out to be a proposition. "We've been thinking," Megan began once we were seated at the table. "This house is starting to feel tight. Not in a bad way, just..." David jumped in. "And we were wondering if you'd consider moving in with us." I stared at both of them. "You want me to live here?" "We could turn the den into your suite," Megan said. "You'd have privacy, your own bathroom. We'd take care of everything." I set my fork down slowly. "Why?" Megan looked me straight in the eye. "Because I don't want Elliot to grow up thinking love is something scheduled. I want him to feel it in the floorboards, in the rhythm of every day," David added. "And because you're not fragile, Mom, you're our foundation." The tears came quickly, before I could stop them. I laughed through them, half embarrassed. "Well, you've really improved your delivery from the baby shower." Megan reached across the table. "You changed too. You became bigger than my fear." It wasn't an easy decision. I had lived in my house for over 30 years. Every creak of the floorboards, every drafty window held a memory. I stood in the doorway of my bedroom that night, looking around at the dresser I'd bought secondhand when David was in middle school, the mirror I'd repainted after his graduation, the quilt on my bed, stitched over months during a lonely winter. But sometimes love asks us to trade familiar stillness for shared chaos. Moving day came quickly. The den was freshly painted in soft oak, and Megan had picked curtains that matched the throw blanket I used at home. There was a small bookshelf in the corner already stocked with some of my favorite novels. They had even included a new rocker near the window for story time, Megan said. As I stood in the center of the room, sunlight pouring in, Elliot in my arms, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, rooted, not in solitude, but in connection. Later, while unpacking, I found a note tucked inside one of the dresser drawers. "We know we didn't start the right way, but we want to keep trying. Thank you for not giving up on us. Love, Megan and David." I placed the note inside my recipe binder, right next to the old card David had once drawn in 2nd grade. A crooked heart and the words, "My mom is the best cook in the world." That night, I sat in the new rocker, Elliot asleep in my arms, the room dim, except for the soft lamp near the bookshelf. Megan walked in quietly and sat on the floor beside me. "I used to think being a good mom meant doing it all alone," she said. I brushed a hand over Elliot's hair. "Being a good mom means knowing when to ask someone to hold the weight with you." She nodded and leaned her head gently against my knee. We didn't say anything else. We didn't need to. There's something surreal about watching your furniture find new corners in someone else's house. The old rocking chair now lived by the den window. My spice rack hung beside Megan's copper pans in the kitchen. Even my coat, threadbare and familiar, rested on a new hook in a hallway where Elliot's squeaky toys were already beginning to accumulate. I adjusted slowly, in small measures. Morning tea on the back porch. Folding laundry with Megan as Elliot gurgled beside us. Leaving the bathroom light on a little longer at night. Not quite used to the layout, but the strange thing was, none of it felt imposed. My presence didn't feel like an intrusion this time. It felt folded in. Still, change, even welcome change, carries echoes. Some nights, I would wake in the quiet, not because of the baby, but because my mind drifted back to the early months after Charles died. That lonely hush, that sharp clarity of loss. Sometimes, you don't realize how starved you were for belonging until you're finally fed. One evening, Megan knocked gently on my door. "Mind coming with me?" she asked. "I want to show you something." I followed her out to the backyard. Snow had melted into patches of dark earth. Along the fence line, small stakes had been placed in a curve, each one marked with a number. "I know we said we'd wait until spring," she said, tugging her jacket tight, "but I wanted to start planning the garden." I raised an eyebrow. "It's going to be yours," she said. "Well, ours, but mostly yours." My throat caught. "You remember I told you about my grandmother's garden? You talked about it like it was church." We stood in silence a moment, the breeze cool against our cheeks. "You don't have to prove anything, Megan," I said. You already let me in. She smiled. This isn't about proving. It's about rooting. The next morning, I found seed catalogs by the coffee pot and a list scribbled in Megan's handwriting. Snap peas, cherry tomatoes, zinnias, basil, marlas, lavender. At the bottom, she doodled a little heart and a wobbly sun. We spent the next week planning. I drew sketches while Elliot napped. David offered to build raised beds with leftover lumber. Megan texted me photos of ceramic planters at the hardware store with captions like, "Too much?" or "You like this one?" Right? Each decision felt like a shared language, one we were just beginning to speak fluently. But not everything bloomed without struggle. It started subtly. Elliot wouldn't settle at night. Then came the colic cries, the fever that didn't break. Megan spiraled into that quiet panic only new mothers understand. And David, bless him, wore his stress like a too-tight collar. They took him to urgent care. I stayed behind, pacing, folding towels I'd already folded, reheating soup no one would eat. When they returned, Elliot asleep and flushed. Megan's face was pale and tight. "It's just a virus," she whispered. But they said to keep him close, monitor him. For 3 days, I tiptoed. I brought warm compresses, helped clean bottles, and whispered lullabies while Megan rested her forehead against the crib rail. On the 4th night, Megan broke down in the kitchen. "I feel like I'm failing," she said, through clenched teeth. "Like every hour I'm not doing something right." I set down the spoon I was using to stir oatmeal. "You're not failing," I said. "You're adjusting, and you're doing it in real time, without a map." She looked up. "Why doesn't it feel enough?" "Because no one tells you that motherhood isn't about getting it right, it's about showing up anyway." She wiped her face with the heel of her palm. "And you keep showing up, even when I don't ask." "I remember what it was like," I said. "I remember holding David at 3 in the morning and thinking, what if I'm the wrong person for this job? But we figure it out together. That's how families work." Megan took a deep breath. "I'm really glad you're here." "So am I." Elliot recovered. The circles under Megan's eyes faded, and the house slowly returned to its new normal. David joked one morning that Elliot was now officially Grandma's boy. The little one would go from wailing to smiling the second I picked him up. "It's the cardigan," I teased. "He knows quality comfort." But beneath the humor, something deeper had settled between all of us. A kind of quiet trust. Earned, not assumed. By early March, the first seedlings had sprouted under the grow light in the laundry room. Tiny, hopeful things, in mismatched pots. Megan came in one afternoon, hands on hips, eyeing the sprouts. "Still think we'll have tomatoes?" "I believe in stubborn roots," I said. "They grow even when you doubt them." She smirked. "Sounds familiar." That evening, after dinner, I stepped out onto the back porch. The sun had dipped low, casting the sky in soft pink and gold. I wrapped my cardigan around my shoulders and took in the view, the stakes in the yard, the faint promise of life beneath thawing soil. Elliot gurgled behind me in his carrier, strapped to David's chest. Megan was sweeping the porch, bare feet on the boards, humming some tune I couldn't place. And me, I was there, not as a guest or an afterthought, but as a root in the ground. Quiet, steady, unseen by many, but essential. I closed my eyes and let the breeze lift my hair. This wasn't just healing. This was home. The first time Elliot reached for me without prompting, I nearly cried. It happened during a sleepy Sunday breakfast. Megan was scooping scrambled eggs onto plates, David was scrolling through his phone, and I was sitting near the window in my usual spot, sipping chamomile tea. Elliot sat propped in his high chair, babbling to no one in particular, when suddenly his chubby arms lifted toward me. "Mama," he said, not quite a word, but close enough to make David's eyebrows jump. "I think he means you," Megan said, a soft grin on her face. I reached for him, and as soon as he was nestled against my chest, he sighed, like all the tension in his tiny body had been waiting for that exact shape to hold him. "He remembers the rhythm," I said quietly. "We imprint each other, whether we mean to or not." No one argued. There was nothing to argue about. The days began stretching longer as spring crept in for good. We moved our dinners to the patio whenever the weather allowed. Megan and I made lavender lemonade from the herbs growing along the fence. David turned the soil in the garden, and I showed him how to mix compost with coffee grounds, something my grandmother taught me decades ago. You always make things feel like they've existed forever, Megan told me one afternoon as we potted tomatoes together. I don't know about forever, I said, brushing dirt off my fingers, but I do know what lasts. One Saturday in April, Megan brought up the idea of returning to work. Just 2 days a week to start, she said, almost cautiously. It's a small grant project at the museum. Remote, mostly. But I think I need to remember I exist outside this house too. I didn't hesitate. You should. Her eyes widened. You think so? I think being a mother doesn't mean dissolving yourself. It means bringing your whole self forward for them to learn what that looks like. We worked out a schedule, easily. Mondays and Thursdays. I'd have Elliot, those mornings, while she set up in the den-turned office. I could hear her typing upstairs while Elliot napped on my chest or banged wooden spoons on mixing bowls in the kitchen. It was peaceful, functional, almost rhythmic. One afternoon, while Megan was on a call, Elliot toddled toward the fridge with the kind of confidence that only babies and drunk philosophers possess. He tugged on the lower handle and looked back at me expectantly. You think I'm your servant now? I teased, reaching for a chilled teether ring inside. He giggled and clapped. I crouched beside him and handed it over. You've got charm, I'll give you that. He leaned forward, touched my cheek with one sticky hand, and said something that sounded like, "Gumma." That time, I did cry. Quietly, but fully. Later that evening, Megan came into my room with 2 mugs of tea. She sat on the edge of my bed like she used to in the early days, when her guard was still slipping down in pieces. I know I pushed you out before, she said, staring into her cup. I don't think I ever properly said why. I stayed quiet, letting her lead. I was scared you'd do it better, or that I'd feel small next to how much Elliot loves you, and that maybe he'd prefer you. I reached over and touched her hand gently. Loving me doesn't mean loving you less. It just means he's surrounded. I see that now, but I didn't before. She exhaled hard, like the words had been trapped under her ribs for months. I never wanted to take your place, I said softly. I just wanted to stand with you. She blinked fast. Well, you've done more than that. You held all of us together. Mother's Day arrived with quiet grace. David cooked brunch, burnt pancakes, and strong coffee, just the way I taught him. Megan handed me a small wrapped box with a sheepish smile. Inside was a gold necklace, delicate and light, with a single engraved charm. Now, it felt right, she said. I traced the charm with my thumb. It is. Later, we took photos in the garden. Elliot smeared dirt on his knees. Megan laughed without worrying about judgment, and I stood beneath the cherry tree, holding my grandson, with sunlight warming my face and the scent of soil rising around us. It was not the life I imagined when I was younger. It was better. That night, as I sat in the rocker beside the window, Elliot already asleep, Megan leaned against the doorway. You know, she said, you taught me more than parenting tricks or feeding schedules. You taught me grace. I smiled at her reflection in the glass. It's mutual. She tilted her head. Do you think it would have turned out this way if I hadn't said that awful thing at the shower? I think it had to, I said, because it brought everything to the surface. Sometimes the worst words reveal what's aching to change. She nodded. I'm glad you didn't let that be the ending. Me too. The house was quiet, except for the occasional floorboard settling. I could hear David in the kitchen, cleaning up, humming something tuneless. I looked around the room, the woven basket of toys, the warm lamplight on the bookshelf, the faint scent of eucalyptus from the diffuser, Megan insisted, helped Elliot sleep better. And in that moment, I understood the quiet gift of full circles. The invitation came in a padded cream envelope with elegant gold script. It was addressed to Marla Evans and family, and sealed with a wax stamp bearing the emblem of the local museum. I opened it slowly, careful not to tear the edges, and read the embossed card aloud. You were cordially invited to the unveiling of the Mothers of Influence community installation, honoring women whose contributions have shaped our city's families. I blinked, read it again, and then noticed the note tucked inside, handwritten in blue ink. I nominated you. They chose both of us. Megan. My hands trembled, just slightly, as I folded the note back into the envelope. Me? A woman of influence? For so long, I'd just tried to survive the spaces between disappointment and duty. I'd never once imagined being honored for it. Megan floated into the kitchen later that morning, still in her robe, hair pinned up and wet from a quick shower. Elliot was teething and had gnawed half the ear off his plush elephant. "You got the mail?" she said casually. "I did." She glanced at me, hesitant. "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked. "I didn't want to make it a big deal, in case you didn't want the attention." "Megan," I said softly, "it's not attention I mind. It's just that I've never really seen myself that way." She smiled. "But you are that way." The following weeks blurred into preparations. Megan and I were asked to submit short statements about our experiences, how we'd helped shape family dynamics, overcome challenges, and built bridges. Megan's was eloquent, full of academic reflection and raw honesty. Mine took longer. I sat at the dining table for days, starting and stopping, until I finally wrote, "Influence isn't loud, it's consistent." I showed up. Even when it hurt. I planted lavender and forgiveness in the same soil. The night before the event, Megan and I stood in front of the closet debating dresses. "You have to wear this one," she said, holding up a soft cream-wrap dress. "It's classic, elegant. You'll look like someone who belongs in a museum." "I don't know. It's a little showy." She rolled her eyes. "You're being honored, not hired." David walked past, carrying Elliot, who had a sock in his mouth. "Wear the dress, Mom," he said. "Seriously. It's perfect." I smiled. "Okay." The next evening, the museum was buzzing with life. Guests wandered through the garden exhibit, wine glasses in hand, music drifting faintly from a string quartet near the atrium. The Mothers of Influence section was arranged in a semicircle, with framed portraits and personal quotes beneath them. I hadn't seen mine yet. Megan had insisted we look together. When we reached the display, I froze. There I was, in a photograph Megan had taken quietly one morning in the garden. My hands were planting herbs, head slightly tilted down, sunlight hitting my gray curls. Beside it, in neat print, was my quote, and below that, nominated by Megan Evans, daughter-in-law. I pressed my fingers to my mouth. "You chose that picture. It's how I see you," she said, her voice tight with emotion, rooted, quietly powerful. I didn't answer right away. My eyes were too full to speak. That night, as we returned home, Megan stopped at the top of the stairs. "I wasn't sure if you'd forgive me." Back then, after what I said, I set my purse down. Forgiveness isn't something you earn with perfection. It's something you nurture with change. She nodded. "You gave me room to become a better version of myself." I looked at her, really looked. "And you gave me a place to matter again." The next morning, we celebrated quietly. David made waffles. Elliot threw half of his onto the floor. I wore my museum badge like it was a royal sash. Megan placed a single daisy in a glass on the table. "To influence," she toasted, lifting her mug. "To continuity," I answered. Elliot shouted something unintelligible, but clearly enthusiastic. That afternoon, I spent time in the garden, checking on the first sprouts of spring. The tomato vines had taken to their lattice. The basil leaves were wide and fragrant, and tucked beside the lavender were two tiny new buds. Zinnias, I thought, the ones Megan added last minute because she liked the name. I knelt by the planter box, my knees cracking slightly, and ran my fingers through the soil. It was darker than it had been last year, richer, stronger, just like us. As the sun began to set, Megan joined me outside, Elliot in her arms. "He's heavy," she grinned. "That's your doing, by the way." I laughed. "Strong roots." She knelt beside me, and we both looked out over the small garden that had become our quiet cathedral. "You ever think this is what it would look like?" she asked. "No," I said, "but I hoped." The summer arrived almost suddenly, as if the season had been waiting just beyond the hedge, then burst through with a grin and open arms. The mornings were brighter, the air carried scents of rosemary and ripe grass, and Elliot had started walking, first with wobbling knees, then with the sure-footed boldness that only toddlers possess. He chased butterflies in the backyard while I weeded the garden, his laugh occasionally punctuating the hum of insects and breeze. Megan often watched from the patio, notebook in her lap, her job now a steady part of her rhythm. "I don't know how we did it before you moved in," she told me one evening, her voice half lost in the sound of the sprinklers hissing. You survived, I said. But now you're living. She smiled, but didn't answer. She didn't need to. Elliot's first birthday approached, and with it, an unexpected tension. Megan wanted something small. Just family, she insisted. And maybe a few friends. David, on the other hand, thought bigger. We can rent the park pavilion. It'll be great. Games, food trucks. Elliot only turns one once. I kept quiet. I had learned the value of silence in decision-making. But when Megan came to my room that night, barefoot and holding a mug of herbal tea, I knew she was ready to ask. Would it be okay, she began, if we did it here? In the backyard? She nodded. It just feels more real. More us. I looked around the room. The scent of fresh laundry still lingered from earlier, and a faint breeze drifted in through the open window. I think that's a perfect idea. Preparations began almost immediately. Megan painted little signs with Elliot's name. David strung twinkle lights along the fence. I baked in batches, lemon cookies, honey bread, and a lavender cake. Megan requested because it smells like peace. We spent the morning of the party setting up. The backyard transformed into something out of a storybook. Blankets layered on the grass, folding chairs tucked under tree branches, and sun filtering through the leaves just so. Elliot wore suspenders and a party hat he hated. He tugged it off within minutes and threw it at the dog. Guests arrived in gentle waves, neighbors, a few co-workers, Megan's sister from out of town, David's college friend who brought too much hummus. Everyone brought warmth, no one brought judgment. At some point, while holding Elliot as he gnawed on a slice of cantaloupe, Megan leaned in and whispered, "He doesn't know yet how loved he is. He'll feel it before he knows how to name it." I replied. She kissed Elliot's forehead and said, "That's because of you." After the party ended and the plates were rinsed and dried, I sat on the back porch alone. The lantern still glowed. A balloon tangled in the garden fence bobbed gently in the wind. David stepped out with 2 glasses of lemonade and sat beside me. "Mom," he said, swirling the ice around, "can I ask you something personal?" I raised an eyebrow. "Of course. Were you ever scared? When you were raising me?" "All the time." He nodded. "You didn't show it. That's the trick, sweetheart. You lead with steadiness, but the fear lives under the surface. It's not failure. It's parenting." He looked at the grass. "Sometimes I think about that day, the baby shower." I waited. I didn't say anything. I should have defended you. "You were trying to keep the peace," I said, "but silence, when someone's being diminished, doesn't protect, it prolongs." David's jaw tensed, then softened. "I've learned that now." "I know." We sat in quiet, the air thick with memory and renewal. Later that week, I received a message from the community center. They were organizing a mentorship program for young mothers and wanted to know if I'd consider volunteering. I read the email twice. Then I forwarded it to Megan with the caption, "What do you think? Too fragile?" She replied, in less than a minute, "You're the strongest woman I know. Say yes." So I did. My first session started the following Tuesday. I met 3 women, each of them tired, in different ways. One worked 2 jobs and hadn't slept through the night since October. Another was navigating motherhood alone after her partner left. The third was younger than Megan, barely 21, and hadn't yet figured out how to hold her baby and her dreams in the same hand. I didn't arrive with advice. I arrived with banana bread, a notepad, and time. They talked. I listened. When they paused, I asked questions like, "What's been the hardest part this week?" Or "What surprised you about yourself?" By the end of that first hour, I could feel something unspoken settling among us. Not solutions, just safety. That evening, back at home, Megan asked how it went. "It reminded me how often we assume we're alone in the hard parts," I said. She nodded. "That's why stories matter, right?" "Exactly," I said. "They remind us that survival isn't shameful, it's sacred." A few nights later, I stood at the window, watching Elliot sleep through the baby monitor's grainy blue screen. His breathing was steady, his fingers curled around the corner of a worn blanket. Behind me, the house was still, dishes done, lights dimmed. A day well lived. I caught my reflection in the glass, soft cardigan, silver hair loose, a face marked by joy and wear. This wasn't what I expected years ago when I thought growing older meant fading out. Instead, I'd grown louder, softer, yes, but louder where it counted. They tried to box me in, with the word fragile. But what they didn't know was that you can be soft and still be made of iron. It's funny how a year can fold in on itself, layers of memory tucked into small, ordinary things. A tiny handprint on the wall, near the stairs, the faint scent of lavender that still clings to Elliot's baby blanket, the soft creak of the rocking chair in the den, the one David tightened last week because he said, even old wood deserves care. The summer passed in quiet abundance. The garden overflowed with green. Megan's zinnias bloomed wild and defiant. Elliot now ran more than walked, his legs constantly in motion, his curiosity blooming at twice the pace. One morning, I found him in the pantry, holding a bag of flour, his face powdered like a ghost. Megan gasped, ready to scold, but I burst out laughing. Let him learn what mess feels like, I said. That's how we find our own edges. Later that day, I got a call from the community center director. Marla, she said, there's been a shift. We want to expand the mentorship program. Would you consider leading it? I paused, stunned. Me? I'm not a professional. You're something better, she said. You're trusted. And these women, young mothers, immigrants, caretakers, they listen to you because you remind them it's possible to build again. That evening, I told Megan. She looked up from her laptop, eyes wide. You said yes, right? I hesitated. I'm thinking about it. She stood and walked over to where I sat at the kitchen table, kneeling beside me like a child might before asking a favor. You once said survival wasn't shameful, it was sacred, she whispered. Don't forget that applies to your story too. I accepted. The first session under my leadership was raw. One mother brought her newborn wrapped in a fraying towel because the hospital blanket had been misplaced. Another whispered through a translator that she hadn't slept without fear since crossing the border. One shared that her partner had left 2 weeks after the baby was born, and she hadn't told anyone until that day. I listened. I nodded. I made tea, and then I shared my own small truth. My son once watched me get publicly humiliated and said nothing, I said. The words gentle, not bitter, and yet here we are, we healed, because healing isn't perfect. It's practice. The room went quiet, not out of discomfort, but recognition. One woman began to cry. Another reached over and took her hand. We didn't fix each other that day, but we stopped pretending we weren't breakable. Back at home, Megan was waiting with a bowl of roasted carrots and couscous, the kind of simple dinner that somehow tasted like ceremony. Any breakthroughs today? She asked. Some cracks, I said, which is where the light gets in. She grinned. Quoting Leonard Cohen now? I'm old. I shrugged. I've earned the right to sound poetic. That weekend, David surprised me with a gift. I know you never ask for anything, he said, setting a carefully wrapped package in my lap, but I saw this and thought of you. It was a leather-bound journal. On the first page, in his handwriting. For all the stories you haven't told yet. I blinked back tears. What if I don't know how to start? Megan leaned over and said, You already did. With us. In the evenings, I'd sit on the porch with the journal, writing in small, careful lines. I didn't try to craft lessons. I just told the truth. The time I stole sugar cubes from church. The day I learned my mother had died while I was folding laundry. The moment I forgave myself for yelling at David during that awful year after his father passed. Stories aren't made of perfection. They're made of presence. One morning in late August, Elliot waddled over to me, holding a small plastic shovel. He tugged at my hand until I followed him to the edge of the garden. There, beside the zinnias, he'd buried something small. A wooden spoon. I later discovered. It's his time capsule, David joked when I told him. But I didn't laugh. Because something about that moment, a child burying a piece of his world in a garden shaped by generations, felt like prophecy. We pass things down. Not always intentionally. Not always clearly. But we do. That night, Megan knocked on my door with a hesitant look. Are you okay with something bigger? She asked. I raised an eyebrow. I want to write about us. About how families break and bend. And sometimes bloom again. About you. About me. About Elliot. And what he'll inherit. My breath caught. You want to tell our story? Yes. But only if you're part of it. I stood and hugged her tightly. If our story helps someone else stay, or leave, or grow, then yes. She rested her chin on my shoulder. Then it's time. We sat at the table until midnight, sorting through memories like puzzle pieces. Not every piece fit neatly. Some were jagged, others soft-edged from use. But together, they formed something real. Not a fairy tale. Not a tragedy. But something true. I never expected to walk into a bookstore and see my life staring back at me from a shelf. But there it was, tucked neatly between parenting memoirs and hardcover cookbooks, roots that hold a story of family, fracture, and forgiveness by Megan Evans. The cover showed a watercolor garden, its paths winding into a sunlit blur. A single lavender sprig curved up the spine. I reached out and touched it, almost unsure if I was allowed. Megan hadn't told me it was published yet. I suppose she wanted it to be a surprise, and it was the kind that rearranges your chest. That night, at dinner, I placed the book on the table beside the rolls. Megan's eyes widened. "Oh no." I tilted my head, amused. "Oh yes. I was going to tell you when we got the official copy. I didn't think they'd stock it so soon." David leaned in. I saw the cover art. "It's perfect." Elliot babbled happily from his high chair, mashing peas with a spoon as if the occasion required green confetti. "I didn't change your name," Megan said, lowering her voice. "You're exactly as you are." I looked at her, really looked, eyes glassy, with nerves, hands fidgeting slightly, like a student waiting for a teacher's verdict. "Then I'm proud to be seen," I said. In the following weeks, Megan was invited to speak at community events, libraries, panels, even a podcast. Sometimes she brought me along. Sometimes I went alone. At one reading, I stood before a small crowd of women and read aloud the section Megan had written about the shower. My voice didn't shake. My hands didn't tremble. I told the truth, not to reopen wounds, but to show the scar could soften. Afterward, a woman approached me. Her eyes were puffy. I thought I was the only one who had to become a stranger in her own family. "You're not," I said, taking her hand. "You never were." Elliot turned too in a blur of finger paint and chocolate cake. He was more words than wobbles now, more questions than quiet. One morning, he pointed to my necklace and asked, "Why this, Nana?" I told him, "It means I belong." He nodded, satisfied. 2-year-olds don't need metaphors explained, they feel them instinctively. That evening, as I tucked him into bed, he looked at me and said, "Stay, okay?" And I did. I kept leading the mentorship group too. The women grew bolder, some started school, others left harmful homes. One even began selling her embroidery online, her patterns full of fierce birds and blooming roots. "You gave me a ladder," she told me. I climbed. I never claimed to be the reason, but maybe I had been the rung they stepped on when they were too tired to leap. One particularly rainy afternoon, I returned from the community center to find Megan sitting in the living room with tears on her cheeks. "Is Elliot okay?" I asked, alarm rising. She nodded. "He's napping. This isn't about him." I sat down beside her, waiting. I got an email from my mother. My heart paused. Megan rarely spoke of her parents. They hadn't come to the wedding, hadn't sent anything when Elliot was born, hadn't even replied when she published the book. She said she read the story, and she's sorry. I reached for her hand. It was cold. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "Part of me wants to write back. The other part wants to delete it and move on." I squeezed her fingers gently. "You don't owe anyone your healing, but you also don't need to carry silence forever." She rested her head on my shoulder. "I wish she'd been more like you." "No," I said. "You needed her to be herself. She chose distance. But look who you chose instead." That night, Megan wrote back. Not with bitterness, not with an open door either, just "Thank you for reading. I'm okay now. I hope you are too." And with that, something ancient inside her seemed to loosen. Weeks later, on a soft autumn afternoon, I took Elliot to the park. He clutched my hand as we walked beneath golden trees. He stopped every few steps to marvel at leaves, birds, pebbles. "Nana," he said suddenly, "you walk slower now." I chuckled. "That's because I like seeing things." He paused, then matched his steps to mine. Later, on the bench while he napped in his stroller, I looked around the park. I saw young mothers on their phones, a grandmother braiding her granddaughter's hair, a teenager walking a poodle in a hoodie, far too warm for October. Life, layered and overlapping, and me, part of it, not beside it. That evening, Megan cooked dinner, rosemary chicken with mashed parsnips. The house smelled like comfort. At the table, David raised his glass and said, "To the woman who turned a fracture into a foundation." I laughed. "You trying to get dessert early?" He winked. "Just giving credit." Megan added, "To the one who stayed when she could have left." Elliot clapped, not understanding, but sensing something celebratory. And I? Well, I held the moment, like a blessing. The first frost came quietly. I noticed it clinging to the garden fence one morning, a thin silver sheen tracing every wire and stem. The tomatoes had finally given in to the cold, their vines slumped and softened, no longer fighting to ripen. I stood by the kitchen window with a mug between my hands, watching the last of the zinnias bow their heads. There was something sacred in endings, too, not just in what bloomed, but in what let go. That same week, the community center hosted a year-end gathering for all mentors and participants. They asked if I'd speak. Just a few words. The coordinator smiled, handing me the mic backstage. "You're the reason half of them kept coming back." I walked up slowly, my knees reminding me to honor their age, not rush them. The room was full, women with strollers, young fathers holding toddlers, volunteers, staff, and familiar faces from my group. Megan and David were in the back. Elliot sat on Megan's lap, chewing on a stuffed giraffe. I took the microphone with both hands, not because I needed the support, but because I had something to carry. "I used to think that fragility was a flaw," I began. "That being breakable meant being weak. But now I know that what breaks can also be rebuilt. And what rebuilds is stronger, not because it's untouched, but because it has been chosen again." Heads nodded, eyes met mine. I felt the pulse of connection moving through the room like a thread. I continued. "You don't need to be perfect to be powerful. You need to be present. You need to stay, even when your voice shakes, even when you're told you're too much or not enough." There was silence afterward, the kind that's full of breath and understanding. And then, applause, long and warm, the kind that reaches into your spine and tells you you were heard. Later, after most people had gone, a young woman approached me. Her baby was strapped to her chest in a soft green sling, cheeks flushed from sleep. "I brought my daughter because I wanted her to see you," she said, almost embarrassed by her own words. I didn't know what to say, so I smiled and touched the baby's tiny hand. "She'll grow into your strength," I told her. "No," the mother whispered. "She'll grow into yours." Winter came with its own rhythm. Megan's book continued to circulate. A local paper interviewed us both. David had it framed. Healing doesn't have an age limit. He hung it just outside the laundry room. Every time I passed it, I'd smile at the thought of our story folding into other people's lives. Elliot started saying longer sentences. One afternoon, while I was folding towels, he looked up and said, "Nana makes soft things." It struck me like a poem, because he wasn't wrong. On Christmas Eve, the house glowed with quiet warmth. Megan baked a fig tart from my old recipe card. David lit every candle he could find. We didn't exchange fancy gifts, just notes tucked into stockings, each with a message, handwritten in different ink. Elliot had drawn 3 green lines on mine. Megan wrote beneath them. He said, "Their roots. Yours." That night, I couldn't sleep. Not from worry, but from fullness. The kind that expands inside the chest until you have no room left for regret. I walked downstairs quietly, wrapped in my cardigan, and stepped out onto the back porch. Snow had just begun to fall. Thick flakes drifted lazily under the porch light, turning the garden into a hush of white. I stepped out barefoot, just to feel the contrast, cold ground, warm heart. There were no words, just the soft crunch of my feet on snow and the sound of my breath making clouds in the air. Behind me, the door creaked. Megan stood there, a blanket in hand. "You'll catch a cold," she whispered, but not unkindly. "Too late," I said. The snow already caught me. She joined me on the steps, wrapping the blanket over both our shoulders. We didn't talk. We didn't need to. In the final days of the year, I finished the journal David had given me. The last page simply said, "What begins in silence, ends in story. And what ends in story continues in love." I left the journal on the shelf above the fireplace. Not locked away, not hidden. just waiting for hands that need it next. Weeks later, I received a letter, handwritten, unmarked, folded into an envelope without return address. Inside was a single line. I see now what I couldn't then. Thank you for holding your ground. No signature, but I knew. Forgiveness doesn't always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it comes like frost. Quiet, inevitable, beautiful, when you don't expect it. Elliot stood beside me, at the garden fence one afternoon, staring out over the frozen beds. Will the flowers come back? He asked. Yes, I said, but not the same ones. He thought about that. I like new ones, he finally said. So do I. And just like that, I knew, whatever came next, whatever bloom or storm or silence, I had done the most important thing a woman can do. I had taken the label too fragile and rewritten it into strong enough to bend and still stay rooted. And I had done it not in spite of who I was, but because of her.